Hey everybody, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching The Decembrists Revolt Against the Tsar by Epic History TV. So this is the second part in Epic History TV's series on the Decembrists. They released this one shortly after I did my reaction to the first part, and so for once you guys are getting an expedited reaction. This reaction will go up shortly after they released this video. I'm excited to continue the tale of the Decembrists. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And without any further ado, let's jump into this reaction.
December 1825. The unexpected death of Emperor Alexander has thrown Russia into confusion. The line of succession had been secretly changed from his brother Constantine to a younger brother, Nicholas. As he struggles to assert his claim to the throne, a secret society...
And part of the reason Nicholas would struggle to assert his claim to the throne is because Constantine was unwilling to head to the capital and renounce his claim. He was cautious and trying to protect himself, so it was a very confused time period, but of course that's perfect for a band of revolutionaries to take advantage of.
Society of Army Officers prepares to make its move. Most are veterans of the wars against Napoleon. Now they want a political revolution in Russia, an end to autocratic government and the abolition of serfdom. The fate of their revolution will be decided in a single day of chaos and violence on the streets of St. Petersburg. They will be known by the month of their uprising, the Decembrists.
You ever notice Russia really likes naming things after months? You got the Decembrist, the October Revolution. They really like pinpointing by the month, but I guess when you have so much revolutionary activity, you gotta separate it month by month.
This video is sponsored by MyHeritage.
Alright, so you guys know the deal. Please go check out Epic History TV's original video, which I will link in the description below. Go click that link, check out their video. Give them a like, check out their sponsor, which they will have linked in the description of their video. So, go show them some love and show them some support for making such fantastic videos.
For sponsoring this video. 14th December 1825, St. Petersburg. The Decembrists Northern Society has its headquarters at the offices of the Russian-American Company, where one of its key members, Revolt, is a major shareholder. Decembrist leaders have been working feverishly day and night to put everything in place for a coup. Revolt is the chief organizer, despite being unwell. Before dawn, they learn that the new emperor has ordered all troops and officials in the capital to swear an oath of loyalty to him that morning. They must act immediately. Once the troops swear the oath, it will be too late. Most Decembrists are officers in the Life Guards regiments, stationed in St. Petersburg. They plan to tell their men that Nicholas, known and disliked by the troops, is usurping the throne from his brother Constantine, to whom the soldiers swore an oath of loyalty just 17 days ago. There is no plan to involve the Russian people in their revolt. These young aristocrats fear that this would only lead to the bloody chaos of the French Revolution.
Yes, and this is a very important point, and I think we'll see the importance of this throughout this video, but this was, as I mentioned in the last video, in fact, a revolution against the elite by the elite. At this point, roughly 80% of Russia's population are rural peasants, and a very high percentage of that group are serfs, tied to the land, really not many rights of their own. Russia has a very small middle class, it's very slowly developing, and its elite is mainly composed of the nobility, who in the grand scheme of things, are a tiny percentage of the country. That's why this is more of a palace coup type situation. This is, the aristocratic elite, the liberal aristocratic elite, trying to perpetrate a coup against the Tsar. They are not really interested in getting the people involved. One, because that would probably be quite difficult, particularly if they're trying to, rally under the banner of liberal Western principles. Most of the peasants in Russia have no interest in liberal Western principles or have literally never heard of them. They would rally under a banner of, organizing against an oppressive landlord, or just a lord, or rally under the banner of Orthodox Christianity, but they're not really familiar with these liberal Western principles. And also, a lot of these liberal nobles really have no interest in getting the people involved. They want to do it on their own, partially because of this fear associated with the French Revolution. A lot of people, even liberals at the time, looked at that and saw how out of hand it got, and they wanted more than anything to prevent the same thing from happening. So this is truly a coup, a revolution of the elite, and we will see how that affects the whole thing throughout this video, I presume.
Instead, they will rely on their social connections and the unquestioning trust of the men under their command. They will then use these troops to seize control of the capital, the emperor, and the government. They will form 3 groups. The first will be led by Captain Alexander Yakubovich, a distinguished veteran of the Caucasus War with a reputation for courage. His men will seize the Winter Palace and secure Emperor Nicholas and his family. Some Decembrists want to keep the emperor prisoner, but Ryleyev secretly entrusts his assassination to 28-year-old Pyotr Kakhovsky, an officer recently retired due to ill health. As a cadet officer in the Life Guards Jaeger Regiment, Kakhovsky had been demoted for rudeness, debt, and laziness. He is a loner without friends or money, but dedicated to the cause of liberty, and imagines himself a slayer of tyrants.
Perfect guy for the job.
A second detachment will be commanded by 32-year-old Colonel Alexander Bulatov, a hero of the Napoleonic Wars and Ryleyev's childhood friend. He's recruited just a few days before the revolt, as the Decembrists seek to involve more senior officers. His unit will seize the Peter and Paul fortress, which contains the city's arsenal and dominates the city center.
Yeah, and Bulatov getting involved only a few days beforehand really highlights how quickly a lot of this was put together, particularly when, the succession crisis emerges. Everything is coming together very quickly. The organization is happening just extremely fast. Everyone's scrambling to get their plans together. New people are getting involved only a few days before the coup is set to occur. So, it kind of gives you an idea of everything, it's not necessarily done in an orderly fashion.
Colonel Prince Sergei Trubetskoy has been appointed dictator, or leader of the coup. He is another officer of proven courage from a distinguished family. He will command the main force, expected to number nearly 10,000 men, which will assemble in Senate Square. Trubetskoy will then enter the Russian Senate and demand that it issues the Decembrists' manifesto to the Russian people. The document announces the establishment of a new provisional government until elections can be held, the freedom of the press and of worship, equality before the law, the introduction of jury trials, and the abolition of serfdom and military settlements.
And if you look at this list, this is basically like the Enlightenment wish list. You can clearly see the influence of the Enlightenment and Western liberal ideology in all of these requests.
2 well-known and respected politicians, Nikolai Mordvinov and Mikhail Speransky, would lead the new government to provide continuity and reassurance.
Okay.
The Decembrists, drawing on their military experience, have come up with a realistic plan to seize control of the Russian capital. But almost immediately, the conspiracy begins to unravel. On a bitterly cold morning, Kakhovsky and Yakubovich come to Rylev's apartments, where the Decembrists have been meeting. Kakhovsky has lost his nerve and is no longer willing to kill the emperor.
Wow.
At the last minute, Yakubovich has also decided he cannot shed the blood of Russian soldiers and refuses to lead troops against the Winter Palace. Bulatov, who is supposed to lead his troops against the Peter and Paul fortress, does not even show up.
See, and this could be one of the issues with a planned insurrection like this, as opposed to a more spontaneous situation like they had in France. In a scenario like this, you're going to have people pulling out, getting cold feet right at the last minute. I mean, this is as late as they could leave it, and that can seriously disrupt your plans versus, you look at the French Revolution. If you're a prominent figure during the early days of the Revolution, it's either you're in or you're out. Everything's already happening, so get involved or go away. But, we're already doing it. In this situation, you can have these important figures with pretty crucial roles in planning who get cold feet and, just don't go through with it at the end.
The Decembrists are in a race against time. There are several Guards regiments in St. Petersburg. They must win over enough of them to secure the capital before the regime understands what's going on and moves against them. But they learn that the Senate and Preobrazhensky Life Guards have already sworn the oath of loyalty to Nicholas. This painting was based on sketches made later by the Emperor himself. It shows the Preobrazhensky Life Guards 1st Battalion arriving at the Winter Palace that morning. It's an act of loyalty for which Nicholas will always be grateful. A battalion of the Moscow Life Guards Regiment comes over to the Decembrists' cause, thanks to the efforts of Captains Shepin Rostovsky, Mikhail Bestuzhev, and his brother Alexander Bestuzhev. But the regime is moving much faster than expected. Officers loyal to Nicholas, now aware of the unfolding coup, arrange for the Izmailovsky, Semyonovsky, and Pavlovsky Life Guards regiments and the Life Guards Horse Regiment to swear the oath to Nicholas. "700 men of the Moscow Life Guards Regiment leave their barracks and march through the icy streets to Senate Square. Their rallying cry is, 'For Constantine and Constitution.'"
And I think that's interesting because you can see that even if it's only nominal, they're still rallying under, I suppose what they would refer to as the legitimate Tsar. Now, they say for Constantine and Constitution, but they're not framing it as necessarily an anti-imperial or anti-Tsarist insurrection. It's an anti-Nicholas insurrection, which in terms of marketing is easier to accept. And this was true for a lot of movements at the time. The French Revolution ended up totally abolishing their monarchy, but they were rather unique in that aspect. Usually, even revolutionary forces wouldn't necessarily call for the abolition of the monarchy. They would just call for a new monarch to be put into place, or for the legitimate monarch, whoever they thought or felt that was. We can also see at this time that everything's already starting to fall apart for the Decembrists. Clearly, I think they were not really ready to go through with it. There was not enough organization done, and, we can see everything's starting to crumble.
men of the Moscow Life Guards Regiment take position in Senate Square, near the famous bronze statue of Peter the Great. They are joined by several Decembrist leaders, including Ryleev and Kakhovsky. Captain Alexander Bestuzhev ostentatiously sharpens his saber on the base of the statue. Officers and men look resplendent in full dress uniform. But Trubetskoy, the leader of the coup who is to present the Decembrist manifesto to the Senate, is nowhere to be seen.
Uh-oh.
And the members of the Senate have already gone home. Ryleev leaves to find him. Crowds of spectators begin to gather around Senate Square. The general mood is one of support for the Decembrists. This watercolor was painted by Karl Ivanovich Kolman, an eyewitness, and is considered one of the most realistic depictions of the day. Around noon, Count Mikhail Miloradovich, Governor General of St. Petersburg and a famous war hero, arrives in the square. He rides straight up to the Moscow Life Guards Regiment and asks, "Who among you was with me at Kulm, Lutzen, and Bautzen?" recalling the great battles against Napoleon. He tells the men they have been lied to, that Constantine has renounced the throne, and they must swear the oath to Nicholas. In Trubetskoy's absence, Lieutenant Prince Eugen Abelensky becomes de facto leader of the Decembrists in Senate Square. He tells Miloradovich to leave, but the general ignores him. Abelensky tries to prick the general's horse with a bayonet to drive him away, but accidentally stabs the general. Then Pyotr Kakhovsky steps forward and shoots Miloradovich at point-blank range. The general, mortally wounded, is carried away by his horse.
Look at that, it's already starting to heat up, though I do wonder if that was necessarily a smart move since, of course, they expected some violence to happen, but this was a man who had led many of them through the Napoleonic Wars. I'm not sure how much love there was or respect, but I'm sure there was a certain level of respect between him and the men and the officers who were making up the Decembrists. So, that is a pretty drastic move to start everything off with.
The Life Guards Grenadier Regiment and sailors of the Guard declare for the Decembrists. They join the Moscow Life Guards in Senate Square. The Decembrists are gathering a powerful, disciplined force of 3,000 troops in the heart of the Russian capital. But Trubetskoy has still not appeared, and there is little leadership. They stand and wait in the freezing cold, while the Emperor begins to mobilize his own forces.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the biggest mistakes. I talked about lack of organization earlier, lack of organization before the attempted coup, but also lack of organization during it. They're gathering this rather impressive group of soldiers, but they're still not really taking the initiative. And that's a big issue in a situation like this, because that allows Nicholas to take the initiative. With every second that the Decembrists don't do anything, that's another second that Nicholas has to prepare and save his position.
Unbeknownst to the men in Senate Square, Prince Sergei Trubetskoy had given up all hope of success early that morning.
Wow.
As soon as he heard that the Senate had sworn its oath to Nicholas.
Well, that's bad
Possibly
news.
suffering some form of breakdown, he wanders around the city, at one point passing by Senate Square itself. His brilliant military record makes such behavior difficult to understand. A Decembrist later recalled, "His absence had a decisive influence upon us and the soldiers too, for with few epaulets and no military titles, no one dared take command." Ryleev, meanwhile, exhausted and sick, spends the day in a futile search for Trubetskoy.
So you have two of your most important figures, and they're not actually there to lead the insurrection on the ground. and, no one else is really willing to take command and take initiative. So that is a massive, massive issue in a revolution, or an attempted revolution like this. That is, one of the number one things you need is that decisive leadership who's willing to make quick decisions.
Before he is forced to retire to bed. The crowd is now several thousand strong, and their loyalties clearly lie with the Decembrists. Some policemen and patrols are even attacked by civilians. When Emperor Nicholas arrives, he and his entourage are pelted with sticks and stones. But Guards units loyal to the government are arriving at Senate Square in force.
Makes you wonder, maybe the Decembrists would have had a better chance if they'd organized a little more among the general population. Like I said, most of the population were peasants, but there was a contingent of working class and middle class individuals, particularly in a city like St. Petersburg. But they didn't, so this is how it's going to play out.
And take up positions surrounding the rebels. Soon they outnumber the Decembrists 3-1, though not all are willing to fire on their comrades. In fact, Isaac's bridge is deliberately obstructed by troops of the Finnish Life Guards Regiment, whose sympathies lie with the Decembrists. Others, such as General Orlov, are outraged by the Decembrists' actions. He orders his Guards cavalry to charge the rebels. His men are pelted with stones and timber thrown by the crowd, and the rebels stand firm. Some shots are fired, a few men are hit, and the cavalry withdraw. Several cavalry charges are made that afternoon, with no decisive outcome, and just a handful of casualties.
So it's kind of a stalemate at the moment, which probably looks pretty good for the Decembrists. They're facing off against the Tsar, and they're managing to keep even with him. But, like I said, the more time that goes on and the Decembrists don't take decisive action, the more time the Tsar has to collect more forces and secure his position.
Still, no Decembrist officer takes charge of the situation.
Yikes.
There seems to be no plan at all. It is -10°C, and their men have been standing motionless for hours. The commander of the Life Guards Grenadier Regiment, Colonel Nikolai Sturler, arrives to order his men back to barracks.
Wow.
Kakhovsky shoots him, inflicting another fatal wound.
Yeah, I once again, another shot by Kakhovsky. I'm not sure if that would be the correct decision. Seems like it might cause some conflict within the ranks, but I don't know.
The metropolitan bishops of St. Petersburg and Kiev approach the troops and tell them it is their Christian duty to swear the oath to Nicholas.
Wow.
But they are mocked and chased away. The emperor is deeply alarmed by the situation in Senate Square, though many comment on his calm demeanor. He later confides to his younger brother, "The most amazing thing about this story is that you and I were not shot." The short winter day is ending. Nicholas fears that if the standoff continues into the night, the crowds will turn hostile. He now has 32 guns of the Guards' artillery at his disposal. He sends General Sukhozanet to tell the rebels to lay down their arms, or they will be fired upon. It's a bad choice of emissary. Sukhozanet is despised by the troops. They tell him to get lost.
Yeah, Nicholas has an interesting choice to make, He doesn't want this whole situation to drag on because, if the Decembrists do decide to make a decisive move, he's just giving them more time to organize. Not to mention, the longer this drags on, bigger crowds could form, people start to really get riled up. He doesn't want that. But then again, if he takes violent action against the Decembrists, he does also risk that inflaming the crowd and inflaming the rest of the revolutionaries and sparking a real battle, which he could lose. So he's got a choice to make, right? And there's risks associated with any option he takes.
As dusk falls, the guns are wheeled forward. The first volley is blank rounds. The next is fired over the heads of the rebel troops, but hits several people in the crowd.
So as you can see, he's decided that he has to end this, but Nicholas is, every step of the way trying to give them an option, the Decembrists, an option to back out. At first it's a warning, then it's blanks, then it's above their heads, and, you can see the progression.
The troops stand firm. The next volley of grape shot is fired directly into their packed ranks.
Yep.
Scores go down. Under this murderous fire, the troops break ranks and head out onto the frozen Neva River. Mikhail Bestuzhev tries to organize them for an attack on the Peter and Paul fortress, little more than 1,000 meters away across the ice. But as they form up, they come under more artillery fire.
And keep in mind, this is the first action that the Decembrists have taken since they showed up. And it's only under these desperate conditions. It's basically already too late, and it's about to get worse. But this is what it took to actually make someone take initiative and try and lead a strike against the Tsar. But, it's too late at this point.
Cannonballs smash the ice. Many drown.
Yeah.
The rest escape as best they can. After a standoff lasting several hours, the military revolt has been ruthlessly crushed by Russia's new emperor. The official death toll is just 80. Eyewitnesses claim it is much higher. The Decembrist leaders, who all survived the bloodshed in Senate Square, are rounded up and arrested that night and the following day. The Decembrist uprising in St. Petersburg is over.
And a quick note on the uprising, this uprising in St. Petersburg. I do give some respect to the rank and file Decembrists. They did show a lot of courage, particularly when they started taking artillery fire and standing their ground. I respect that. They stood up for their principles. But, and I mentioned this before, the big reason this failed, and I think this is pretty generally agreed upon, is that there was not enough organization, particularly on the day. They kind of showed up to Senate Square and didn't have much of a plan, particularly missing two of their most important leaders, and no one else was really willing to step up, and so they kind of just hung around when they should have taken the initiative, and they might have had a good chance of overthrowing the Tsar. Maybe not, we don't know how things would have gone, but by standing around, they definitely were lowering their chances of success. So, I do respect the courage, but, there's a serious lack of initiative and, decision-making abilities among their ranks, at least in that moment.
The revolt in the south has yet to begin.
Yeah, I'm less familiar with the situation in Ukraine, so I'm curious to learn about this.
13th December 1825. Tulchin, Ukraine. The day before the St. Petersburg revolt, Pavel Pestel, leading figure of the Southern Society, is denounced by one of his officers and arrested.
Uh-oh.
The Southern Society's plans for an uprising are thrown into chaos.
Once again, your leader has been removed from the picture, but, look, you need good leadership in a revolution, but you also need to be ready to continue, without a particular leader. Though, as I mentioned earlier, when someone important is removed in this sort of planned insurrection, that can cause massive issues. Whereas, compared to the French Revolution, a lot of that was just the mob doing its thing. There were a lot of important leaders, don't get me wrong, but a lot of the momentum was created by the mobs of Paris. And they were definitely led in different directions by certain leaders, but even without those leaders, the mobs would have ran around and committed violence. Whereas in this case, we've got, this elite revolution, carefully planned, or sometimes not so carefully planned, to be honest, with people in specific positions, and then when you remove those people, we're seeing they end up with serious issues.
Sergei Muravyov-Apostol takes over as leader. He receives news of the disastrous uprising in St. Petersburg, but decides to go ahead with the planned rising in the south.
All right.
On the 29th of December, he is arrested himself, but quickly freed by fellow officers. The next day, he leads 2 companies of the 29th Chernigov Regiment into Vasilkov, where they seize money, weapons, ammunition, and supplies. 3 more companies, more than 400 men, join the rebels. The next morning, a revolutionary manifesto, written by Muravyov-Apostol and Lieutenant Mikhail Bestuzhev-Ryumin, is read out to the troops. In the question and answer form of a religious catechism, the document calls for an uprising to end autocracy, serfdom, and conscription. Question: what does our holy law order the Russian people and army to do? Answer: to repent of our lengthy servitude and stand against tyranny and wickedness, vowing that in heaven and on earth there shall be only one emperor, Jesus Christ.
It's pretty standard stuff, though. Putting it in the form of a religious catechism might be more appealing to the, quite religious populace of the empire.
By the 1st of January, Muravyov-Apostol leads a force of 17 officers and 1,100 men. He attempts to march on Zhytomyr to link up with units of the 8th Infantry Division, whose officers are sympathetic to the Decembrist cause. But his route is blocked by government forces. Then, on the 3rd of January, at Ustimovka, his force is intercepted by troops under General Geismar. Muravyov-Apostol...
And I will say, before we even get into this battle, considering that the revolution in St. Petersburg has already fallen apart and Nicholas has begun to secure his position, even if the Decembrists were successful out here in Ukraine, it would probably at best be a provincial revolt that would be put down by the imperial government. So I think, unfortunately, even if we see some success here, it won't matter too much in the grand scheme.
Hopes the opposing troops will join him. Instead, they open fire with grape shot.
Wow.
Then the hussars charge. A few men are killed, but most quickly surrender. 895 men and 6 officers are taken prisoner, including Muravyov-Apostol, who is badly wounded. His brother, Hippolyte, and another Decembrist officer, Anastasy Kuzmin, take their own lives to avoid capture. The Decembrist uprising in the south is over.
There you
Crushed in just 5 days.
Yeah.
In St. Petersburg, the Decembrist leaders are interrogated by Emperor Nicholas in person before they are sent to the Peter and Paul fortress. The Emperor gives instructions on how each prisoner is to be treated, whether they are to be kept in shackles and treated severely.
And by the way, those interrogations are some interesting primary sources if you're interested in the Decembrists. You get some interesting information, particularly on the motivations and inspirations of the Decembrists. A lot of them talk about how they picked up these liberal Enlightenment ideas from their time in Europe during the Napoleonic Wars, which I remember we talked about in the last episode, how, all these Russian officers being around Europe, fighting in the Napoleonic Wars, they were really influenced by the Enlightenment philosophy they encountered. And so a lot of them talk about that. A lot of them also talk about how they were inspired by the liberal constitution granted to Poland, and how Tsar Alexander had agreed to be the head of this liberal constitutional country. Of course, he never lived up to that promise. Russia would never respect Poland's constitution or its institutions. But a lot of them talk about how that made them hope for liberal institutions in Russia itself. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in there, in those primary sources, those interrogations.
Or more gently, he despises them all. Trubetskoy he describes as a repellent example of an ungrateful scoundrel.
Wow.
Nicholas sets up a commission to investigate the plot and its origins. 579 suspects are arrested and subjected to repeated interrogations, long periods of solitary confinement, hunger and cold, or feigned sympathy. Many confess freely, revealing details of secret societies and names of co-conspirators. A few resist defiantly. Colonel Bulatov, who was to have led the attack on the Peter and Paul fortress, is so racked by guilt that he kills himself in his cell.
Wow.
There are no trials as such. 5 months later, the commission returns its verdicts to the emperor. 290 are acquitted, 289 are guilty, with 121 judged to be the greatest offenders. A Supreme Criminal Court is formed to carry out sentencing, according to 11 categories of guilt. Devised by Mikhail Speransky, the man the Decembrists had hoped would lead their new government.
Yeah, Speransky, as we talked about in the last video, he was a liberal figure. He wanted to bring Western enlightened liberalism to Russia, but you must remember, he was always working within the government. Even at times, he did not have the favor of the Tsar and the imperial apparatus, particularly during the Napoleonic Wars. He sort of fell out of favor, but he would always work within the government apparatus. That's how he wanted to do things. He was sort of law and order type liberal. He wasn't necessarily interested in revolution.
Those found guilty of minor crimes are demoted and sent to fight in Russia's long-running war in the Caucasus.
Yep.
Along with the regiments that joined the Decembrists. 31 of the Decembrists found guilty of the most serious crimes: conspiracy, rebellion, desiring the emperor's death, are to be executed by beheading. But Nicholas shows mercy and commutes their sentence to hard labor for life in Siberia. Before they depart, officers are stripped of their rank and noble privileges.
Yeah, it's a good way to avoid making martyrs. We had these failed liberal revolutionaries, and instead of killing them, they're sent to Siberia. So they can't even be viewed in the future as these brave heroes who died for their beliefs, because they weren't executed by the government. They were just sent into exile. So I think that's a pretty smart move from Nicholas.
And ceremonially disgraced. Their greatcoats are burned, their swords snapped in half.
Yep.
This is the punishment handed out to Nikita Muravyov, who drafted the Northern Society's constitution for a new liberal Russia. And to Prince Sergei Trubetskoy, the Decembrists' vanishing leader, whose life is only spared because of his family name. 5 Decembrists will not be spared. Piotr Kachowski, Sergei Muravyov Apostol, Mikhail Bestuzhev-Ryumin, Pavel Pestel, and Kondraty Ryleyev. A public death for the chief instigators and conspirators will be their lawful revenge for disturbing the public peace.
And here we have the group of those deemed too dangerous to be left alive, or expendable enough to be executed. That's the lineup here. We have some of Ryleyev and Pestel, two of the most radical figures of the revolution. Deemed probably too influential and too radical to be left alive.
Nicholas writes to members of the commission. All 5 are sentenced to death by quartering, a brutal punishment involving public dismemberment.
Yikes.
God and the sovereign have decided my fate. I must die, and die a shameful death, Ryleyev writes in a final letter to his wife. Pray to God for my soul.
Hmm.
13th July, 1826. Nicholas commutes the sentence to hanging. But the execution of the 5 Decembrists by the ramparts of the Peter and Paul fortress is badly botched. As the men are hanged, ropes break, and 3 men fall to the ground. What a miserable country. They can't even hang us properly, remarks one survivor.
Oh my God.
Spectators appeal for mercy. According to tradition, a man who survives a hanging should be spared.
Right.
Instead, more rope is found. And the second time, there is no mistake.
Yeah, I mean, that's a bad way to go. You know that when you have your sentence commuted to hanging, that's your sentence commuted, you're in a bad way. And also to be done so brutally and negligently. Yeah, that's a pretty horrific way to go.
More than 80 Decembrists were eventually sent to Siberia. A few were accompanied by their wives, who voluntarily renounced their own noble privileges to be with their husbands.
Oh, that's nice.
Conditions in Siberia were not as extreme as might be imagined. Their hard labor was mostly farm work. Wealthy prisoners were sent money from home, which they used to buy supplies. For active young men, boredom was the greatest enemy. They took up hobbies, played chess, painted. These watercolors were painted by Nikolai Bestuzhev, who on the 14th had led the Imperial Guard sailors to Senate Square. Some formed their own academy, sharing their knowledge and going on to teach local children and set up schools.
Yeah, and this will remain to be true of Exile in Siberia. Now, it is pretty terrible to be ripped away from your life and have to start over, stripped of your possessions, your rank, forced to, work as a laborer. That is all very rough. It's true. But it's not, sometimes I think when we imagine Exile in Siberia, we imagine these, truly horrific conditions of squalor and just terrible, constant, hard labor. It actually wasn't too bad. Like the narrator just said, for a lot of these men sent to Siberia, oftentimes the biggest problem was boredom, finding something to do. A lot of them would read a lot, keep up with the news back home. In the future, not necessarily this bunch, but in the future, a lot of exiles to Siberia will remain politically active in one way or another. So it isn't necessarily as horrifying as we might imagine it, but, still obviously not a good situation to find yourself in.
They remained hopeful of a pardon, but it proved a 30-year wait. Only in 1856, after the death of Emperor Nicholas, was an amnesty announced for surviving Decembrists.
Wow.
Among them, Prince Sergei Trubetskoy, who returned to Russia and is seen here, photographed in 1857.
Jeez.
The Decembrist uprising seemed to have been a total failure. A wildly optimistic operation, poorly planned, chaotically executed,
Yep.
doomed from the beginning.
Yep.
The loss of life, thoughtless and unnecessary. But the Decembrists had mounted the first organized political revolt in Russian history. As such, their impact would prove far-reaching. The recent conspiracy, wrote the British resident minister in St. Petersburg, failed from want of management and want of a head to direct it, and was too premature to answer any good purpose. But I think the seeds are sown, which one day must produce important consequences.
That's an impressive amount of foresight, and I think he's exactly right, and I completely agree with the assessment Epic History TV is presenting. You know, the revolution itself was an unmitigated failure, and much of that was due to the leadership, planning, and organization of the Decembrists themselves. But, it did definitely inspire future generations and sow the seeds for more dissent, simply because it was the first, sort of modern liberal revolt of its kind in Russia.
Emperor Nicholas was never interested in reform. The issues of serfdom and a constitution would be around for decades to come.
Yep.
For those who took up the cause of reform, including Russia's liberal intelligentsia and future revolutionaries, the Decembrists were an inspiring example of action in the face of tyranny. The father of Russian socialism, Alexander Gertsen, was their great champion. He named his political journal Polar Star, after Relev's own. On the cover of its first edition, the 5 Decembrist martyrs. In time, the Decembrists' aims, the abolition of serfdom, a constitution, even the overthrow of the Tsar, were achieved.
I mean, yes, but as you can see, it would take a long time. Decembrists operate in the 1820s. They can wait roughly 40 years for the abolition of serfdom, and about 80 years for a constitution, and almost 100 years for the abdication of the Tsar. In terms of the way Russian politics was going, they were definitely ahead of the curve. As you can see, for how long it took for each of their goals to be achieved. Not to mention that each one of these political events on screen, you could add many caveats to each one and many issues. But that would be a whole other discussion. But yeah, they were very ahead of the curve in terms of Russian politics.
But their brand of 19th century liberalism was soon overtaken by events in Russia.
Yeah.
The communists never completely approved of the aristocratic Decembrists, though in 1925 they did allow Senate Square to be renamed Decembrist Square to mark the 100th anniversary of the Rising.
Interesting.
But the Decembrists' place in Russian history remains highly contested to this day. A 2019 Russian blockbuster film was accused of trivializing the Decembrists and their aims. Others called for the film to be shown in schools. While in 2008, the St. Petersburg Square, where the Decembrists made their famous stand, was renamed again, back to Senate Square. The Decembrists continue to serve as a warning to some, an inspiration to others. All that is certain is the Decembrists have not been consigned to history just yet.
Wow. Okay. Great video. I really enjoyed that little mini-series on the Decembrists. I honestly didn't know that the role of the Decembrists in Russian history was such a hot topic even today in Russia. I didn't know it was still, debated. But then again, I suppose I shouldn't be so surprised because, like they were in 1825, Russians today live under a tyrannical conservative regime. So I suppose, these liberal revolutionaries would still be controversial about 200 years later, even though it's crazy to say. I guess that doesn't make sense given the current political climate of Russia. I had a really good time with this mini-series. Epic History TV always makes fantastic videos. I enjoyed their presentation of the Decembrists, learning a little bit more about the Decembrists. If you guys enjoyed this video, then I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below and has exclusive content. I hope all you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.